Hello, I'm Dick Carter, Chairman of the Delaware Heritage Commission. 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the ratification and signing of the Declaration of Independence, signaling the birth of a new nation in which popular representation, individual liberties, equality, and human dignity are valued cornerstones of society.
The experiment begun in 1776 was something untried in history. It is an experiment that continues to this day, as we still strive to live up to the full promise of our revolutionary founding. But it was a brave beginning.
The Delaware Heritage Commission, a citizens commission made up of Delawareans from all walks of life and dedicated to the understanding and preservation of the history of our state and its people, is proud to present Caesar Rodney's Ride, the story of Delawareans and the Declaration of Independence.
The reddish-orange sun rising up over the Delaware River on the morning of July 1, 1776, portends a hot, hazy, and humid day for the residents of Philadelphia. The day promises to be especially heated at the Pennsylvania State House, where the Second Continental Congress expects to take up the question of American independence. It has been 24 days since Richard Henry Lee of Virginia brought matters to a head by offering a resolution stating,
"Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved of all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved."
After more than 3 weeks of delay, as delegates contacted their state legislatures for instructions, a vote is expected this day. That it will receive the votes of a majority of the 13 colonies is virtually a foregone conclusion. But the unanimity that the advocates of independence believe is critical is far from certain. The delegates from New York have yet to receive instructions from their legislature. New Jersey's legislature has elected new delegates who are in support of independence, but they are not here yet. The South Carolinians, led by the young aristocratic planter Edward Rutledge, are concerned that with independence, the northern states might run roughshod over the South, especially when it comes to the matter of slavery. The delegation from Pennsylvania is deeply divided, and even Delaware is not certain. John Adams of Massachusetts, the Continental Congress's leading advocate for independence, has been awake since before the sun made its first tentative appearance over the river. In the pre-dawn hours, he has been writing a letter to a friend.
This morning is assigned the greatest debate of all, a declaration that these colonies are free and independent states, has been reported by committee some weeks ago for that purpose, and this day or tomorrow is to determine its fate. May heaven prosper the newborn republic.
But Adams knows that there is still much work to be done this day. Among Adams' key allies is Thomas McKean of Delaware. McKean plays a key role in Adams' strategy, for he is not only a delegate from Delaware, but a prominent political figure in Pennsylvania as well.
We're here in the Delaware Assembly Room of the Newcastle Courthouse Museum, where 3 weeks ago, the Delaware Assembly voted for independence from Great Britain and separation from Pennsylvania. And we're here with David McKean, who's the author of Suspected of Independence, The Life of Thomas McKean, America's first power broker, a biography of his illustrious ancestor. David, thank you, and we appreciate you joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mike.
So in the summer of 1776, Thomas McKean's 42 years old. Can you fill us in on his life and career up to this point?
Thomas McKean was born in Newcastle County. He had an older brother and a younger sister and a younger brother. His father was an innkeeper, tavern owner. Sadly, their mother died when Thomas was only 8 years old. The father, who was not a terribly astute businessman, decided that he really didn't have the wherewithal to care for 4 children. So he shipped the younger children off to an aunt and uncle, and Thomas and his older brother Robert went to a boarding school. They stayed there for several years. Robert then went off to London to study medicine, and Thomas came back to Newcastle and lived with his cousin. David Finney, who was quite a prominent citizen. He spent the next years following him to every meeting and to every court appearance. And he learned the law. And in those days, there were not law schools. You learned as an apprentice. By the age of 20, Thomas McKean was a very successful lawyer in his own right, became quite wealthy at a very young age. He was then elected to the Assembly. He collected customs for the English government. And then he was appointed part of the three-person delegation to the First Continental Congress, and then again the Second Continental Congress, which brings us up to 1776.
He worked for Great Britain for a while then. What led him, McKean, to come to the conclusion that independence from Great Britain was not only warranted, but necessary?
A number of people in public life in those years did not contemplate separation from England. And certainly Thomas McKean was one of them, but if you look at the founders, many of them did not believe early on that they should separate from the crown. Thomas McKean obviously changed his mind, and while he didn't write about exactly when he changed his mind, my sense is that it happened after the First Continental Congress. Then a number of things happened, and so what were those events? Ones that everybody's familiar with. The first shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. After that, there was something of what I would call a militarization of the colonies. The English government sent a number of soldiers to the United States. And I think there was a resentment that no longer were people at the local level allowed to make their own decisions. There was also an attempt to make sure that the economy was completely controlled by the British.
Well, it seems as though Caesar Rodney was certainly the most prominent of Delaware's delegates to the Continental Congress, but truly Thomas McKean was the leader of that delegation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Caesar Rodney was a very wealthy man. He owned hundreds of acres. So I don't think it's surprising that many people look to him as one of the most authoritative figures. Thomas McKean was younger. He was not as wealthy, but he was something of a political operative. He worked both the Delaware delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation in months and days leading up to the Declaration of Independence. And that is when Thomas McKean decided that it would be critical to get Caesar Rodney back to the Congress, because he was actually in Kent County at the time. There'd been a local uprising that he was handling.
But I wanted to ask you about McKean's relationship with John Adams. He seemed to be a key ally in the Mid-Atlantic region, and of course he was very prominent in Pennsylvania and in Delaware.
So John Adams was from Massachusetts, and he had a number of the same views as Thomas McKean did. Initially, he felt that it was important to seek reconciliation with Great Britain. And when he arrived in Philadelphia, one of the very first people who he met was Thomas McKean. And they seemed to instantly like each other. I think they had a lot in common. They were both from fairly prominent delegations. They both had radical elements to those delegations as well as conservative elements. And there's a point where Adams writes, Caesar Rodney, Thomas McKean, and Patrick Henry are the three who he thinks see most clearly to the end of this business, is how he puts it, which I thought was just fascinating.
So let's reset it and come back to the room where it all happened, and that is this very room here, the Delaware Assembly. And that is when McKean in June of 1776 traveled back from Philadelphia to Newcastle to participate in a session here in the Delaware Assembly, which not only declared Delaware's independence from Great Britain, but also separation, formal separation from Pennsylvania. And it also provided guidance to Delaware's delegates at Philadelphia. What was Thomas McKean's role in all of that?
He was convinced at that point that independence was the route that the colonies needed to take. And so that he gave a very convincing speech about that to his fellow assemblymen. And there was some division at the time in Delaware. There were those who, again, believed right up until the end that reconciliation was important. There were 3 or 4 states, including Pennsylvania and Delaware, that were on the fence. And so that McKean's ability to persuade his fellow assemblymen was key. And ultimately, they did authorize a vote for independence. Delaware had this sort of odd relationship with Pennsylvania. The 3 lower counties had their own assembly. They were known as Delaware. But the governor was Pennsylvania, and he represented both the lower counties and Pennsylvania. There had been a de facto separation for a number of years. This became a de jure separation, where from then on, Delaware would be a colony, and ultimately after the vote for independence on July 2nd and July 4th, Delaware would be a state.
George Reed's vote against independence in that test vote on July 1st seems to have blindsided Thomas McKean.
If it did blindside him, it shouldn't have, because he knew George Reed quite well. He knew he was more conservative. George Reed was a member of the Court Party, and McKean was a member of the County Party. Again, Thomas McKean was well aware of this. The problem was that George Reed, actually hadn't showed up for a lot of the meetings at the Second Continental Congress. So I'm not sure the extent to which Thomas McKean really had a chance to talk to him about this before the vote.
So the following morning, July 2nd, had to be a very tense time for McKean. Dover is 80 miles away, and Rodney, though he's not an invalid, is certainly not in the best of health. And McKean had sent a courier, but there's no way of knowing if the courier had even gotten to Rodney. So here we are.
George Reed, McKean's friend and neighbor in Newcastle, is cautious about independence.
George Reed, my fifth great-grandfather, is now 42 years old. He's already a promising lawyer and legislator. He lived with his wife, Gertrude Ross Reed, the daughter of the first rector and longtime rector of Emmanuel Church, the Reverend George Ross, as well as their 4 children. Reed was a Delaware lawyer, and he received his training in Philadelphia. And like most Newcastle lawyers, he practiced both here in Newcastle and in Philadelphia. He's been a Delawarean since infancy. He came back to Delaware in 1754, and he's always been known for his calm and deliberate reasoning. That was an integral part of his personality and his approach to life and politics. In 1763, he was appointed by Governor John Penn of Pennsylvania to be the Crown Attorney General for the 3 lower counties, Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex. But he resigned that post after having been appointed to the Continental Congress. I think he sensed a conflict between those two. And he was also a 12-year veteran of the Colonial Assembly. Although he was an early critic of the Stamp Act, and although he was a member of the Committee of Correspondence, which facilitated communication among the 12 other colonies to coordinate opposition to British acts of repression and taxation, he was by nature a cautious politician. Like John Dickinson, he had real doubts as to whether or not the colonies, if war broke out, could achieve military victory against Great Britain. And even if that happened, he had doubts, along with John Dickinson, just how well or successfully the colonies could govern themselves. Just a few weeks ago, his colleagues in the Colonial Assembly put him in a difficult spot by instructing the 3 delegates to the Continental Congress to support independence. You can imagine the bit of a quandary he was in.
A thriving port city with significant economic, familial, and political ties to England, Newcastle has a great deal at stake should independence become a reality. This is manifested in George Reed's hesitancy. Much of the Newcastle establishment shares Reed's concerns. But younger residents, like 37-year-old lawyer Nicholas Van Dyke, believe that the time has come. Van Dyke, who lives in this house just a couple of blocks from the courthouse, is a member of the militia and an up-and-coming figure in Delaware politics. 2 years ago, he was appointed to the Committee of Correspondence, formed among the colonies in the wake of British closure of the port of Boston. He is close to both Reed and McKean. But on the question of independence, he, like much of his generation, is firmly in the Patriot camp.
Delaware's 3rd delegate, Caesar Rodney, generally conservative by nature, but a staunch supporter of independence, is back in Delaware. As Speaker of the Delaware Assembly and Major General of the Delaware Militia, he has been occupied with Delaware's decision to formally separate from both England and Pennsylvania, and with increased Loyalist activity in Sussex County.
Caesar Rodney is the most famous of Delaware's signers of the Declaration of Independence, and yet we aren't really even sure what he looked like. A painting of his nephew, Caesar Augustus Rodney, was said to resemble the famous signer, but we don't really know. John Adams said of him,
He's the oddest looking man in the world. He is tall, thin and slender as a reed. His face is not larger than a large apple, yet there is a sense and fire, wit and humor in his countenance.
The Rodneys were a part of the landed gentry of Kent County. Caesar Rodney was born just after midnight on October 7th of 1728. He was born into a fairly prominent political family. His grandfather, William Rodney, was the first Speaker of the Delaware Assembly in 1704. Like most large landowners in Kent County, the farm was dependent upon the labor of enslaved men, women, and children. This is an arrangement that Rodney would have grown up with and not questioned until much later in his life. But this arrangement would have given Rodney the leisure to pursue a career in political life. Indeed, because of the labor of their enslaved workers, the Rodneys lived a life more like that of modest country squires than of average colonial American farmers. Caesar grew up in an Anglican church in a community where most well-to-do Anglicans thought of themselves as very loyal subjects to the crown. His public service probably grew out of a sense of noblesse oblige rather than any great desire to change the status quo. As the oldest of 8 children, and with a father dying in 1745 when Caesar was not even 18 years old, Rodney became the head of his family. His mother did remarry and had 2 more children, but without a wife of his own and the oldest of all of these siblings, Caesar Rodney became the de facto patriarch for the Rodney clan. Thomas Rodney is Caesar Rodney's youngest full brother, and he often served as Caesar's political confidant, secretary, and assistant. Unfortunately, Thomas was a bit of a firebrand, headstrong and impetuous, traits that did not always serve either of them well. That didn't always serve Caesar well, particularly politically, in a state which was largely still very conservative. Caesar was a bachelor and destined to remain so the rest of his life. It does seem that he was in love once. There was a woman named Mary Vining, known as Polly, that he seemed to have an affection for. When an outing between the two of them never materialized in the 1760s, Caesar wrote to her expressing his disappointment.
I'm deprived of the greatest pleasure this world could possibly afford me, the company of that lady in whom all my happiness is placed. I love you from my soul. In this, believe me. I'm sincere and honest, but when I think of the many amiable qualifications you are possessed of, all my hopes are at an end.
Sadly, Rodney lost out. Mary married an English missionary named Reverend Charles Inglis. She died in childbirth in 1764. She was buried in the Christ Church graveyard in Dover, and every time that Rodney goes to church, he passes by the grave of the young woman whom he lost twice, once to a rival suitor, and again to the permanency of death. In 1755, Caesar Rodney helped to organize a militia for the Dover Hundred, and was later appointed a captain of an infantry company. That same year, he was elected as sheriff of Kent County, a very powerful position responsible for maintaining law and order in the county. He was later made a justice of the peace. In 1761, Caesar Rodney was elected to the Colonial Assembly. The next year, he and Thomas McKean were appointed to organize the various laws of the 3 lower counties. In 1763, he was elected to be the Register of Wills for Kent County, and at the same time served as the Recorder of Deeds. In 1769, Caesar was appointed an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the 3 lower counties, as Delaware was known at the time, and he remained serving in that position in 1776. Clearly, Caesar Rodney was wearing many hats. Very few in Rodney's social circle would have spent so many of their years serving in public life. Indeed, few of them would have been asked so often. But Caesar was known for a rectitude and integrity that extended beyond personal friendship and political partisanship. He has acquired the reputation of being able to reconcile the interests of competing factions. In fact, his obituary would later note that he was modest without meanness and steady without rudeness, and he was well known for his disarming wit. It's unsurprising that Caesar started out in politics more conservative. He grew up in his 20s, starting out in the court party. But his political leanings began to shift later in his life as he became friends with more radical members of the country party. Caesar's conversion to the cause of independence was a gradual one. We don't know all of the factors that led to it. Certainly, the increasing taxation from England was a contributing factor. We also know that he was slowly swayed by the convincing arguments of John Adams and the Congress over the years. In a strange twist of irony, an informal militia that Caesar had organized 20 years ago as a loyalist British force to defend in the French and Indian conflict would finally see action this time against the British. In January of 1775, when it reorganized as the tensions with England grew, 2 regiments were formed for Kent County. Caesar Rodney was appointed as colonel of the 1st, with Thomas Collins serving as his lieutenant colonel, and John Hazlitt was appointed the colonel of the 2nd Regiment. By 1776, Caesar was fully committed to the cause of independence. There has been a great deal of unrest recently with Loyalists in Sussex County. On June 13th, the General Assembly received reports that Loyalists down near Cedar Creek, northwest of Lewis, had been in contact with British warships off of the Delaware Bay, off of Cape Henlopen. They were calling for arms and support from British troops. The Delaware militia sprung into action. Hazlitt and Collins were sent south to respond to the problem. Troops from Wilmington and Dover started to head to Sussex County. Even though Caesar is the Speaker of the Delaware Assembly, he is also commander of the Delaware troops. So once legislation separating Delaware from Pennsylvania has passed, he immediately begins to head to Sussex County to deal with this new threat. The immediate threat in Sussex County subsided quickly once the Loyalists heard that the militia were on their way down the road. However, things did not completely cool down. We know that these Tories remained in contact with the British warships, ready to take advantage at any opportunity. Rodney stayed in Sussex County a few days until he had made sure that all the matters had stabilized sufficiently to head back home.
The opposition to the resolution for independence is led by John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania delegate, but the owner of his family's plantation near Dover. Dickinson, a longtime critic of the British Crown, believes that the calls for independence are premature. He doesn't believe the Americans can win the war, and he doesn't think that the colonies are ready to stand alone. American diplomat Silas Deane is in Paris, hoping to enlist the French in the American cause. Dickinson wants to wait for word from Deane before taking this drastic step.
The John Dickinson plantation near Dover was the ancestral home of the Dickinson family. John Sweeney, author of John Dickinson, The Constant Watchman of Liberty, can tell us a little bit more about the history.
John Dickinson was born in Talbot County in 1732. By the time he was 7, the family moved here to Delaware at the present-day mansion outside of Dover. This became his home. No matter where he lived, and he spent much of his life in Philadelphia, this was home to him. This is where he wanted to come and relax. However, he did become a lawyer, and in the 18th century, for a Delaware lawyer to make any money, you had to go to Philadelphia, and he did. And practicing law in Philadelphia was very lucrative for him. He took all kinds of cases. He became an established lawyer. He was known as an eloquent advocate. And naturally, that attracted him to the people who ran politics. He was first elected to the Assembly in Delaware, served a term there, and then he was elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly. He was a junior member of the Quaker Party, as it was called informally. They didn't have parties as we have them today. But the leader of that Quaker Party was none other than Benjamin Franklin. And in 1764, Franklin moved and was seconded by his party to request the king to make Pennsylvania a royal colony. John Dickinson, a junior member of the Assembly, up until then a supporter of Franklin, stood up and opposed it, shocking Franklin and his supporters. His idea was that the people themselves had to be the ones to decide whether the government should be changed. And he wrote a number of speeches and pamphlets condemning the move. Well, he paid the price for it. He was voted out of office. Franklin then went to England for 10 years to advocate for this change. In the meantime, Dickinson kept arguing that we can't trust the king. Remember, it was King George III. And he says, that's going to come back and haunt us. And sure enough, in the next year, in 1765, it did. In 1765, King George's ministers in Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act added a tax to every single piece of paper that was moved through the courts, even on newspapers. To buy a newspaper, you had to pay a tax. This didn't sit well with Americans, and John Dickinson became one of the leaders in Pennsylvania against the tax. There was a Congress held in New York. Dickinson was a leader of that Congress. He wrote all of the official papers, and he wrote several very influential essays that were circulated as pamphlets. 2 years later, in 1767, the king and Parliament came back with the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts put duties on smaller items, such as glass and lead and other products. Again, Dickinson came to the front, and he wrote a series of letters known to us as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Now, he was a lawyer in Philadelphia. He wasn't, but he got the idea of just sitting there on his nice farm. But it was a very insightful, very political, and very philosophical attack on the king's power and Parliament's power especially. He became famous, and he was known throughout the country as the farmer. Even Samuel Adams declared the farmer to be a special Bostonian, which was the greatest honor he could give anyone. Dickinson went on to write other papers, both on his own, his essays written under his name or a pseudonym as they used in the 18th century, but also official papers. That's how John Dickinson became known in the 19th century as the penman of the Revolution. But there was more. When the Continental Congress was formed, he was called upon to settle disputes between different delegates and come up with a paper that represented all of the views. He also wrote some essays, such as a letter to the inhabitants of Quebec, trying to get the Canadians to join the coming revolution as a plea to say, if you join us, you will have these rights. And what he did is he outlined what is essentially a Bill of Rights. If you look at it today, it reads just like the Bill of Rights that was passed, ratified 17 years later. Dickinson was the man. He was the go-to man for all of these official papers. They admired his writing style. They admired his diplomacy and getting people together and to agree on a common point. He wrote all of the papers up until the Declaration of Independence.
So it sounds like as much of a proponent for the rights of the American colonists as Dickinson was, he was opposed to independence in July of 1776. Why was that?
By July of 1776, he had pretty much came around to the idea that independence and a war with Britain would be inevitable, but he didn't think the time was right. Now, he wasn't just a writer, he was also a colonel in the Pennsylvania militia, and he trained a full company, and he was an advocate for getting ready for battle. But he said, and he told his fellow congressmen, that we're not ready yet. We don't have any allies. We will be out here alone. He also pointed out that the colonies didn't get along. They didn't have a government. So part of the answer from people like John Adams and Samuel Adams was to assign Dickinson the job of writing what would be our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. They lasted for a few years. They weren't perfect because he had to settle all of the different disputes. It wasn't strong enough to carry us through. But remember, at the end, we did get the Confederation Articles that would help us govern the revolution. Dickinson didn't vote against the Declaration of Independence. What he did is he realized that the tide was turning, and that if he voted against it, the total for Pennsylvania would be nay on independence. And he thought at this point it should be unanimous. So he stayed away from the vote to allow the yes votes to win. And as soon as the vote was taken and the declaration was approved, John resigned from Congress and then went off to lead his troop outside of New York where the British were. So he was willing to fight for the revolution, even though he didn't support it. It's hard for us to realize what an effective writer John Dickinson was. In the 18th century, he perfected the styles that people accepted. In fact, he was such a good writer that he wrote the first best-selling songs and the first #1 hit in America. It's the Liberty Song, and it has a political message, and he's calling upon Americans to unite and fight the idea of no taxation without representation. And in it, he gave us the phrase, united we stand, divided we fall. His ability as a writer to pull thoughts together was so appreciated at the time that if he had not been against independence at the time, he would have been called upon to write the Declaration of Independence. Now, that would be something to consider, the differences in philosophy of Thomas Jefferson and John Dickinson. John Dickinson wasn't as enamored of natural rights as he was historical precedent. So our whole idea of who we are might be a little different.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Of course, neither John Dickinson nor many of the other founding fathers, including George Read and Caesar Rodney, would have had the ability to do their patriotic work were it not for the labor of enslaved human beings. Here on the grounds of the Dickinson plantation is the final resting place of many of those who toiled without freedom while John Dickinson wrote of liberty. What are the most important things we need to know about the men and women who rest here in this field and their daily lives?
So the people who lived here were a variety of people. And the people who lived on this plantation were here willingly and unwillingly. We talk about the enslaved individuals, the indentured servants, the tradespeople, the craftspeople, the free black people who lived, labored, and died here. They would be living in a house similar to the one behind us. It's called a log dwelling. It's made out of log. It has a hard-packed dirt floor, and this is their home year in and year out. These homes like this would be scattered along the landscape. The people who were working here worked from sun up to sundown. Originally, the Dickinsons brought enslaved individuals here, and that would be mothers, fathers, children. All of them would have been owned or considered to be owned legally by the Dickinson family. John Dickinson inherited a number of enslaved individuals in 1760 when his father died, and he owned them for 26 years. They stayed here in some cases after they were manumitted or freed, but others left, and then others were indentured to work for John Dickinson. So after 1786, there were enslaved individuals here, free black people here, and indentured servants, all living and working. Did they get along all the time? Everyone? No. But this was a community. This was the St. John's Neck community. And they had to work to make it profitable for themselves and for the Dickinsons. We have always known that there was an African burial ground here on the property. We just didn't know where it was. It got lost in history. And so in 2021, we rediscovered the burial ground. And we looked at the records from the time period. John left extensive records. And so it talks about a burial ground. It talks about digging ditches to reclaim the burial ground from the water that was encroaching upon it. It talks about a post and rail fence around the burial ground. Oral history says 400 people are buried there. And so when we discovered the burial ground or rediscovered the burial ground, we know that our work is just beginning, that we are now looking for descendant communities to make decisions on how to further interpret the site as a site of enslavement, and also what to do about the burial ground. How do we honor the people who lived, labored, and died on this plantation and are buried there in that burial ground?
Reconciling John Dickinson, the promoter of American liberty, and John Dickinson, the slaveholder, is not an easy task.
When you talk about people like Mr. Dickinson, we recognize his work that he did to help create this nation. But we don't quite understand all the actions that he took and why he took them. We do know that he was an enslaver. He did own, at 1786, as many as 60 men, women, boys, and girls. We know that when he was writing that Liberty song and talking about freedom will live and freedom we're born and freedom will live, he wasn't talking about everyone because he was owning other people at that time. So we just tell the truth about Mr. Dickinson, that he's a complex man. So even though John Dickinson is considered one of our founding fathers, no one is without flaws.
Back in Philadelphia, John Hancock bangs his gavel at 10 o'clock, and the session is underway. Lee's resolution is read aloud, and the Congress organizes itself into a committee of the whole, meaning that the entire body will act as a committee to review the resolution and vote on whether to move it forward for a final vote. Benjamin Harrison of Virginia takes over as the chair of the committee of the whole. It is a good way to get a test vote to measure the support for the resolution. There is little doubt that it will receive the votes of a majority of the colonies, but it will demonstrate just how far short of unanimity that support is. John Dickinson, gaunt, pale, and believing that he is about to end his political career, stands to open the debate as outside rain begins to lightly fall against the windows of the State House. He does not want to say publicly that he believes the colonists will lose the war and are not yet ready, but reiterates his belief that the declaration is premature.
The consequences involved in the motion now lying before you are of such magnitude that I tremble under the oppressive honor of sharing in its determination. My conduct this day, I expect, will give the finishing blow to my one too great end, now too diminished popularity. It will be my lot to know that I had rather vote away that than the blood and happiness of my countrymen. I had rather that they should hate me than that I should hurt them. But thinking as I do, silence would be guilt. I do most humbly implore Almighty God, with whom dwells wisdom itself, so to enlighten the members of this house, that their decision will be such as will best promote the liberty, safety, and prosperity of these colonies. Sir, gentlemen of very distinguished abilities and knowledge differ widely in their sentiments upon the point now agitated. They all agree that the utmost prudence is required in forming our decision. I fear the virtues of Americans, resentment of the injuries offered to their country may irritate them to counsels and to actions that may be detrimental to the cause they would die to advance.
Dickinson goes on to discuss American independence in light of the general war amongst the great powers, Britain, Spain, and France, around the globe. Would Spain, he asks, see the Declaration as applying to their own colonies in North America? And would France, Spain's ally against Great Britain, which has thus far been unwilling to aid Spain in her ambitions in North America, continue to do so if their ally now viewed independent American colonies as a threat? What's more, would the French, with whom Silas Deane is currently in Paris negotiating some kind of alliance, break off those talks, viewing American impetuosity as a premature affront to their own standing and believing that the Americans were not negotiating in good faith? What if, Dickinson argues, this declaration persuades the British to offer Florida to Spain and Canada to France, putting a squeeze on the American colonies? Therein lies the danger of a premature declaration of independence. He speaks to the prudence of patience, of letting the negotiations with the French come to a resolution, of quietly assuring Spain that the Americans have no designs on their colonies in North America. Dickinson then turns to the need for the disparate colonies to get their individual state governments in order before abandoning the protection offered by London. Finally, he argues that independence now will lead to ruinous debt, the burning of towns, the British turning the local Native Americans against the colonists, and an increasingly cruel war with no prospect of a quick end in sight, weakening the very unity which the Declaration seeks to establish.
To escape from the protection we have in British rule would be like destroying a house before we have got another, then asking a neighbor to take us in and finding he is unprepared. It is claimed that the spirit of the colonies calls for such a declaration. I answer that the spirit of the colonies is not to be relied on. Not only treaties with foreign powers, but among ourselves should precede this declaration. We should know on what grounds we are to stand with one another. When our enemies are pressing us so vigorously, when the sentiment and designs of our expected friends are so unknown to us, I'm alarmed at this declaration being so vehemently presented.
The relationship between Dickinson and Adams is not a friendly one. Last year, a political dispute got personal when Adams wrote a private letter disparaging Dickinson's tactics. British agents intercepted the letter, and it was published in several Tory newspapers. The resulting enmity between the two is real. Nonetheless, as he gets up to respond, John Adams believes that Dickinson has acquitted himself well.
He had prepared himself apparently with great labor and ardent zeal. He conducted the debate not only with great ingenuity and eloquence, but with equal politeness and candor.
As Adams begins to speak, the rain escalates into a thunderstorm. The gist of his lengthy argument is, if not now, when?
I give my heart and hand to this vote. It is true indeed that at the beginning we did not aim for independence, but there is a divinity which shapes our ends. Why then should we defer the declaration? We may die colonists or die slaves. But while I do live, let me have a country, and that a free country. Before God, I believe that the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready to stake on it and leave off as I began. Live or die, survive or perish, I am for this declaration. It is my living sentiment, and by the blessing of God, it will be my dying sentiment.
As Adams makes his case, the new delegates from New Jersey arrive, forcing the irritated speaker to start over again. But Adams can't be too angry. The new delegates move New Jersey firmly into the pro-independence column. But when the vote to adopt the resolution in the Committee of the Whole is taken, 4 colonies remain unconvinced. South Carolina remains opposed, still concerned about northern domination of the new nation. The New York delegates continue to await instructions from their legislature. Pennsylvania's delegation remains faithful to Dickinson and has narrowly voted against the resolution. Dickinson and Robert Morris, along with Thomas Willing and Charles Humphreys, are opposed. 2 of Dickinson's protégés, John Morton and James Wilson, however, have joined Benjamin Franklin in favor of independence. And, to Thomas McKean's surprise, George Read has voted no, leaving the Delaware delegation deadlocked. Shocked and angry at his colleague, McKean, at his own expense, hires a courier to ride to Dover, find Caesar Rodney, and beseech him to come, post-haste, to Philadelphia.
Having heard from Read that the matter of independence would be debated on for quite some time, he probably felt pretty comfortable to return home to rest and recuperate in Dover for a few days. It was during these few days of rest that McKean's messenger would suddenly arrive.
Near the end of the day, word arrives from New York that a British fleet has been sighted off Sandy Hook on the New Jersey side of New York Harbor, casting yet another cloud over the fight for independence. Finally, Edward Rutledge asks that the final vote be postponed until tomorrow. Though his South Carolina delegation has been opposed, Rutledge, the youngest member of Congress, has previously shown some sympathy for the idea of independence. What's more, he is concerned about standing in the way of unanimity. The delay is the greatest gift that Edward Rutledge will ever give to his country. After the session ends, and the delegates are leaving for the evening, the young South Carolinian quietly tugs at McKean's coat. He will deliver his state's vote for independence. At a nearby tavern, McKean joins John Adams, his cousin Samuel Adams, and the new delegates from New Jersey to bring them up to date on the situation. McKean recounts his brief conversation with Rutledge. "What about Delaware?" one of the New Jerseyans asks. McKean reveals that he has sent a messenger to find Rodney. With a bit of bravado and a lot of hope, he assures the group that Delaware will vote yes.
as night falls. John Dickinson is in a quandary. He genuinely believes that the Americans will lose the war, and that in any event, the colonies are not yet at a point where they can stand alone as an independent nation. At the same time, he knows that the die is cast. The resolution on independence will pass tomorrow, and that it is important that the colonies present a unified front. But he cannot, in good conscience, vote for the resolution.
Edward Rutledge has spent the evening working on his fellow delegates from South Carolina. All have agreed to support independence.
Around midnight, there is a knock on the door of Rodney's home. It is the courier, bearing McKean's urgent message. According to a letter written by Caesar's brother Thomas to McKean years later, Caesar immediately calls for his carriage and sets off for Philadelphia.
A carriage? Wait, I thought he rode a horse.
Well, we don't really know. We have Thomas Rodney's description of the ride, but in Thomas McKean's description, he mentions that Caesar Rodney arrived at the Pennsylvania State House wearing his boot and spurs, which he wouldn't have done if he had ridden only in a carriage, so it's very likely that he rode part of the way in a carriage and part of the way on horseback, but we'll probably never really be certain.
Duck Creek, now the town of Smyrna, is an important shipping center. Grain, produce, lumber, and tan bark used to make leather make their way through Duck Creek on the journey north. The Smyrna area is rife with supporters of independence. Rodney's colleague from the Delaware militia, Allen McLean, a native of Duck Creek, is now an officer with the Delaware Regiment in the Continental Army up in New York, where a British fleet has just sailed into view offshore. As Rodney journeys north on this July night, he likely passes this house, known as Belmont Hall, a frequent spot for patriotic meetings. Built in 1773, Belmont Hall is the home of Brigadier General Thomas Collins, a large landowner and another of Rodney's colleagues in the militia. Like Rodney, he is a prominent political leader of the day. A veteran of 5 terms in the Assembly, he, like Rodney, Reed, and McKean, was active in the Delaware Assembly's recent decision to separate not just from England, but from Pennsylvania as well. When Newcastle was threatened by the British later in the year, Collins will open up his home for the Delaware Assembly to meet. That meeting is memorialized in a painting on the wall of the parlor.
Rodney's route takes him through the town of Campwell's Bridge, today known as Odessa, where in 1731, the Campwell family, substantial local landholders, built a toll bridge across the Appoquinimink River. Shallow draft shallops once sailed up the creek into the protected port of Campwell's Bridge, where farmers could ship their goods in 2 directions, north via the Delaware River to Philadelphia and via the Bohemia River to the Chesapeake Bay and points south. Today, the town is home to the National Historic Landmark Corbett Sharp House, built by wealthy Quaker tanner William Corbett in 1774. Adjacent to this sophisticated Philadelphia, Georgia mansion house sits the home of Corbett's brother-in-law, David Wilson Sr. Wilson was the town's most prosperous merchant. He built his home, which was more typical of Delaware Georgian architecture, in 1769. It's late at night, and the town is dark, except for the occasional candle in one of the local homes as Rodney rides through.
At the state capital of Newcastle, along the Delaware River, Rodney reportedly stops to change horses in the wee hours of the morning of July 2nd.
It's most likely still dark as Rodney crosses the Christina River into Wilmington. Wilmington is a compact borough of a little more than 1,200 people with a history of nearly bloodless conflicts for dominance. Swedes and Finns of the New Sweden colony encountered the indigenous Lenape in 1638. They were unseated in 1655 by the Dutch and finally were dominated by the English in 1669. Quaker merchants from Philadelphia now play an increasingly important role in city life, and the city's population has just surpassed Newcastle, making it the most populous in the state. It has a very desirable geographic advantage that will help it prosper, because it not only lies between the thriving ports of Baltimore and Philadelphia, but it has the enormous economic potential of three rivers of very different character: the mighty Delaware, the placid Christina, and the powerhouse Brandywine. Wilmington excels at the import-export business with the West Indies from docks on the Christina riverfront. In addition to sailors and shipbuilders, merchants and millers, the city is home to coopers, carpenters, bankers and businessmen, patriots and loyalists. When Caesar Rodney makes his unplanned trip to Philadelphia on July 1st and 2nd, 1776, he has plenty of options for urgent hospitality in Wilmington, given his long career in government and the Delaware militia. Fresh horses could easily be found at stables from Front to High Streets. Caesar would later confide in his brother Tommy that he considered Wilmington to be a relief from Philadelphia. Wilmington will remain an important military wayside for both factions during the Revolution. General George Washington will establish his headquarters here in August of 1777, just before the Battle of the Brandywine, where the heights of Quaker Hill will give him an excellent view of the Delaware and the sneaky British Navy. Although shipbuilding industries are strong here in 1775 and 76, the milling of southeastern Pennsylvania grain on the Brandywine Creek has put Wilmington on the map since the 1730s. These mills, run by Pennsylvania Quakers, are on the north side of the Brandywine, an area just outside of the borough in Brandywine Village.
Brandywine Village, along Market Street on the north bank of the Brandywine Creek, is home to a number of flour mills. One of those millers, Joseph Tatnall, a strong supporter of independence and one of several prominent Quakers in the neighborhood, lives in this house. His Quaker faith prevents him from fighting, but his mills will supply flour to the Continental Army.
Having made his way through Wilmington in the pre-dawn hours, Rodney crossed the Shellpot Creek, arriving at the foot of the steep and imposing Penny Hill. Halfway up the hill, Arthur Penny built his house in 1749, minus the stone wall. His sons David and William operate their cabinetry business out of the house. It was a popular stop on the road to Philadelphia because of the cold, clear water and from the natural spring on the property.
Probably around daybreak, Rodney passes this house along the Philadelphia Pike, not far from Naaman's Creek, just south of the Delaware-Pennsylvania border. Built in 1723, it's the home of Colonel Thomas Robinson, brother-in-law of American General Anthony Wayne of the Continental Army. He's also a friend of General Washington. The emerging daylight brings an added sense of urgency to Rodney's ride. A bit later, Rodney rides through the town of Upland, Pennsylvania, home of the Morton family, here along Darby Creek. This area is heavily Loyalist, but John Morton, a Pennsylvania delegate once opposed to independence, has changed his mind and now supports Richard Henry Lee's proposal.
Caesar Rodney wears a green silk scarf, partly to hide the horrible disfigurement that he had suffered fighting with an unsightly skin cancer across his nose and cheek for many years. He had been weighing a trip to England to seek treatment, but with his signature on the Declaration of Independence, that dream would never become a reality. Although he's often depicted as robust and healthy in his ride, at age 47, he's now very gaunt and sickly. Later, it will be said that the signers of the Declaration of Independence were signing their own death warrants. For Caesar Rodney, this may actually be true.
Caesar Rodney has yet to arrive as the delegates gather at Independence Hall on the morning of July 2. Also absent are John Dickinson and his Pennsylvania colleague Robert Morris. It is not a coincidence. While both are opposed to independence at this time, they recognize that Lee's resolution is going to pass and are unwilling to stand in the way of unanimity. This will leave Pennsylvania's vote at 3-2, Franklin, Morton, and Wilson versus Willing and Humphreys in support of independence, swinging the state to the I column.
Rodney crosses the Schuylkill River at Gray's Ferry west of the Pennsylvania State House area. It is currently the only crossing point of the Schuylkill River from the south into the city. On the bank of the river stands Gray's Tavern, where just over a year ago, General Washington, the newly appointed commander of the Continental Army, was welcomed at a dinner hosted by members of the Continental Congress, including Adams, Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson.
McKean has been on the lookout for Caesar Rodney since early morning. There have been thunderstorms throughout the night, and the weather still looks threatening. Who knows how much it has held Rodney up? Finally, up Chestnut Street, a rider comes into view. It is Rodney. McKean greets him at the State House door. With Rodney splattered with mud as a result of the storms, and still wearing his boots and spurs, the two enter the chamber, and an exhausted Rodney settles into his seat. As the roll call on independence begins, Dickinson and Morris remain absent, leaving the Pennsylvania delegation split 3-2 in favor of independence. As promised, Edward Rutledge has brought the South Carolina delegation around to supporting independence. Still awaiting instructions from their legislature, the New York delegation continues to abstain, but they will not vote against the resolution. When Delaware is called, Rodney rises to his feet.
As I believe the voice of my constituents and of all sensible and honest men is in favor of independence, and my own judgment concurs with them, I vote for independence.
Without a single dissenting state, Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence has passed. The American colonies have broken their ties to Great Britain. Years of hard fighting remain to secure that independence, and in 1787, delegates from the 13 colonies, among them some of the same individuals who have voted here on the question of independence, will have come together again in this same building to craft yet another document, a constitution which will create a working government reflecting those principles. But that is all in the future. There is no turning back.
The public careers of these Delaware patriots did not come to an end with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, each of them had years of public service ahead of them. Attempting to walk a fine line between the conservative leanings of his constituents and his own support for independence, Caesar Rodney was defeated for re-election to the Delaware Assembly later that summer. He turned his attention full-time to his role as Major General of the Delaware Militia. In the fall of 1777, after the Continental Army's defeat at Brandywine and the British occupation of both Philadelphia and Wilmington brought the war closer to home, Rodney was re-elected to the Assembly, which returned him to the Continental Congress. However, his activities in Delaware prevented him from congressional service. On March 31, 1778, the Assembly elected Rodney president of Delaware, a role now known as governor. He served until shortly after the British surrender at Yorktown in 1781, when his health had begun to worsen. In 1783, Caesar Rodney was elected to the Legislative Council, the upper house of the Delaware legislature, and in honor of his long service to the state and nation, was selected as Speaker. He was in such ill health that the council met in Rodney's home until his death on June 26, 1784. Like Rodney, Thomas McKean was not returned to the Continental Congress in the summer of 1776. He was, however, elected to the convention, which drew up Delaware's new state constitution and was the primary author of that document. He was elected to Delaware's Assembly under the new state constitution and succeeded John McKinley as Speaker after McKinley was elected President of Delaware. In 1777, after McKinley's capture by the British, McKean briefly succeeded him as president. Also like Rodney, McKean was returned to the Continental Congress in 1777, where he served until 1783. During the war, his family was forced to move 5 times to evade capture by the British. In 1777, McKean was also named Chief Justice of Pennsylvania, where he served for 22 years. At times, holding high public office in both states, he was also a member of Pennsylvania's convention that ratified the Constitution of the United States and went on to become governor of Pennsylvania from 1799 to 1808. In 1812, at 80 years old, He led a citizens group to organize the defense of Philadelphia during the War of 1812. Thomas McKean died in Philadelphia on June 24, 1817. The only one of the 3 Delaware delegates to be returned to the Continental Congress in the summer of 1776, George Reed served until the end of 1777, while at the same time serving on Delaware's new legislative council and as acting president of Delaware from October 1777 to March 1778. He continued to serve in either the Assembly or the Legislative Council throughout much of the 1780s. Reed was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and after the ratification of the Constitution, served as one of Delaware's first 2 United States Senators, serving until his appointment as Delaware's Chief Justice in 1793. George Reed would serve as Chief Justice until his death on September 21, 1798. John Dickinson could not, in good conscience, sign the Declaration of Independence. He believed that his refusal to support and sign the document marked the end of his political career. He was wrong, because the Continental Congress had determined that no one who had not signed the Declaration could remain in Congress. He resigned and joined the Pennsylvania militia. Dickinson was given the rank of Brigadier General and put in nominal command of troops in northern New Jersey, becoming one of just 2 members of the First Continental Congress to take up arms in the conflict. However, because of his stance on independence, he was unpopular among the troops. Dickinson resigned his commission that December and returned to his home in Delaware. Of Dickinson's 2 homes in Philadelphia, one was confiscated and turned into a hospital, and the other was burned by the British. Back in Delaware, state leaders wanted to appoint John Dickinson to the Second Continental Congress, but he declined. He enlisted as a private in the Kent County Militia under Rodney during the Philadelphia campaign. McKean, then president of Delaware, appointed him a brigadier general of the Delaware militia, but he declined that as well. Finally, in 1779, he returned to public life as one of Delaware's delegates to the Second Continental Congress, serving for just over 2 years. Dickinson also served in the legislatures of both Delaware and Pennsylvania, and was president of Delaware for a year before becoming president of Pennsylvania in 1782 and serving for 3 years in that role. Increasingly bothered by the institution of slavery, Dickinson unconditionally freed all of his slaves in 1786. In 1787, Delaware sent him to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where he played a key role in the creation of the United States Senate as part of the Great Compromise, under which one house of Congress would have equal representation for each state, while the other would have representation based on population. After the convention, under the pseudonym Fabius, Dickinson published a series of articles designed to rally support for the new Constitution. In 1791, he was elected president of Delaware's convention to revise its 1776 Constitution. Dickinson was then elected to the state Senate in 1793, but served just a year before ill health forced him to resign. He did remain active in public debate on a number of political issues. John Dickinson passed away in Wilmington on February 14, 1808.